Well, joining me now is the chair of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, Ben Wikler. Thanks for coming on the show here today.
Thanks for having me, Lance.
All right, so first let's talk about Janet Protasewicz's victory. Democrats or Democrat-backed candidates have fared very well here in statewide elections. Why do you think that is?
This is a state that is purple, but it has a progressive, beating blue heart. If you ask Wisconsinites what they want freedom, they want control over their own bodies, they want a functioning democracy, they want the tradition of Wisconsin encoded in our state motto, which is forward, as opposed to going back, let's say, to 1849 and to a time before women had the right to vote and a state legislature passed a blanket ban on abortion. That's not what Wisconsinites are looking for, and that's shown through on April 4th unmistakably.
For this spring election, the Supreme Court election we just talked about, and the last fall election, abortion was a huge issue. But I saw from Protasewicz's own campaign recently, they made some comments that said, you can't just run on that single issue. Is that the message you're giving to Democrats who are getting ready to run in 2024, especially since that issue might change as far as the state abortion ban before the next election?
No campaign is about one issue. The question is whether abortion should be an issue and maybe the central issue. And the answer to that question is yes. In Wisconsin Supreme Court races, often it's a battle over crime. And in this race, Dan Kelly's ads were almost all featuring fear-mongering, divisive, often really race-baiting, tough on crime, fear of crime messages. Janet Protasewicz's campaign countered that, showcased her lifetime as a victims' rights advocate, a prosecutor, a judge, and then introduced this question about abortion, personal freedom, and democracy. And that combination, showing that Dan Kelly was an extremist, really carried the day. I think we saw the same thing in the governor's race last year. Governor Evers was unmistakably, clearly pro-choice, pro-reproductive freedom, and made the case that Tim Michels was too extreme for Wisconsin. I think that's a message we might also see in 2024.
You mentioned abortion. So I'll ask you, as far as the abortion ban and with redistricting maps, is the Democratic Party going to be directly involved at all in any challenges to those at the Supreme Court level?
Janet Protasewicz committed on the campaign trail to recusing herself if the Democratic Party of Wisconsin is a litigant, and we honor that. We will not be bringing any lawsuits before the Supreme Court. There are tons of different folks, I'm sure on both sides, who are thinking through their legal strategies. That's not the Democratic Party of Wisconsin's job.
Tammy Baldwin just announced that she's going to be running for re-election here coming up in 2024. Obviously, she won pretty handily in the last re-election campaign in 2018. Ron Johnson just won, though, and a whole bunch of money went his way in that Senate race we just saw a few months ago. Does that concern you when you saw how much money went that way as to what will happen here in 2024?
This is Wisconsin. We're the land of the nail-biter. We may have won by 11 percentage points on April 4th, but 4 of the last 6 presidential elections came down to less than 1 percentage point. And in 2022, it was a 1-point race, the closest Senate race in a century in our state. So at the same time, we know that Tammy Baldwin is absolutely dynamite. She works so hard for Wisconsinites in every corner of the state, and we're very confident about her effectiveness as a candidate for re-election. At the same time, we take nothing for granted, and we have to expect a huge Republican campaign to try to defeat her and get a majority in the U.S. Senate to pass a national abortion ban. If we can hold the Senate, win the House, and win re-election for the White House, we could pass Tammy Baldwin's Women's Health Protections Act, which would encode Roe versus Wade reproductive freedom as the law of the land nationally. And that, frankly, is what Americans are looking for, what Wisconsinites are looking for. So we relish the opportunity to make the case to folks across the state that it's time for a third term for Senator Baldwin. I think we will win, but I also take, again, nothing for granted about what we might see from the other side.
I'm curious. Part of your job is obviously to see what the trends are and how voters are going to go one way or another. How do you explain the voters choosing Ron Johnson and Tammy Baldwin, who seemingly are so different as state senators here? And what is it that you're seeing have been driving those races?
We have one of the biggest gaps between the two senators of any state in the union. And frankly, we are the most purple state. We're the only state that's had I think at this point 11 elections come down to less than 1 percentage point this century. No other state comes close to the number of incredibly tiny margins in major high-stakes statewide contests. So it's a state that's polarized. It's also a state where there's some folks who feel conflicted. Maybe they feel one way about abortion, another way about gun violence. What that means is that for Democrats as well as Republicans, we have to try to earn the vote of people in all communities across gender, geography, generation, race, ethnicity. just about everyone can cast a ballot that tips an entire statewide election. And when you look at Ron Johnson, he had enormous resources, as you mentioned. He was an incumbent, so he had a built-in advantage. The national average was about a 2.2 percentage point advantage for incumbents. Without that, of course, he would have lost by a point instead of winning by a point. With Tammy Baldwin, she has incumbency. She also is a lot more popular than Ron Johnson was, and that puts wind in our sails. But we have to expect the GOP to throw down everything to win that race and frankly, to try to turn Wisconsin back into the red column in the presidential fight. So my message to Democrats is take a moment, take a breath, celebrate the victory on April 4th, and then roll up your sleeves because we are at the center of the political universe once again.
You mentioned that, and part of that is the presidential race. Tammy Baldwin's going to be on potentially the same electoral ballot as Joe Biden. Are you concerned at all about the president's popularity with Wisconsin voters heading into this election?
Every election is a choice. And when voters see Joe Biden, see what he's done, see what he's fought for, and then compare that to what we're seeing from the Republicans, from people like Donald Trump or, God help us, Ron DeSantis, who campaigned for Tim Michels before Tim Michels collapsed in the 2022 gubernatorial race, I think it's very clear that Joe Biden is the person who's been sticking up for Wisconsinites, working Wisconsinites in every corner of the state, and fighting for the soul of America. That's what he launched his campaign on in 2020. That battle is still raging. And Joe Biden calls on the best of all of us to come together and make a country that works for everyone, where democracy thrives, rather than trying to overturn election results, as Donald Trump did in January 6th of 2021.
Well, you mentioned to me this is going to be kind of the center of the political universe in the country in 2024. We're going to have the RNC convention in Milwaukee. The DNC is now going to be down in Chicago. How do you see it playing out? Is there an advantage at all having the proximity the way it is for here in the state of Wisconsin?
I was publicly advocating that the Democratic National Convention come to Chicago rather than going to New York or Atlanta, because I think it does create a vivid contrast. We're going to see President Biden and Vice President Harris and the values of the Democratic Party on a stage where TV signals reach right into Wisconsin in the Chicago media market. And the contrast between that and what we can anticipate from the Republicans with their convention, I think will make the case by itself to Wisconsinites that really one party's candidates, one presidential ticket is on their side. And it's not the party that tried to overturn their votes in the last election and is trying to pass a national abortion ban. It's President Biden, Vice President Harris, Tammy Baldwin right there helping lead the Democratic ticket in Wisconsin. I'm so excited about the convention.
All right, it's going to be an interesting year coming up for everyone here in the state of Wisconsin. I want to thank you so much for the time here, Ben Wikler.
Never dull in Wisconsin politics. Thanks so much.